When you talk about Star Wars, almost everybody has an opinion. The franchise has been around for almost 50 years and has solidified itself as a cultural icon in our history. It's been the topic of many debates, both over lunch and on TV. There's been countless parodies, tons of fan-made content, and references sneak their way into current media all the time. So it's no surprise that there are plenty of complaints about the franchise over the years as well. While there were plenty of debates prior to 2012, before Disney acquired the LucasFilms production company, as well as the revitalization of the franchise, these complaints started to seriously divide the fandom as time went on. But before we can talk about how the Star Wars fandom ended up in such a fractured state, we have to look at how the franchise itself evolved over the years. Not just in terms of what stories were told, but when they were told, who told them, and how each era shaped what people expected from Star Wars. This isn't going to be a beat-by-beat breakdown of every movie. Instead, it's a look at how each wave of films were received, how those reactions shifted over time, and what that tells us about the growing tension between the creators and the fans. It starts with the Skywalker saga, the 9 films that form the backbone of the franchise. These are the movies that follow the rise and fall of the Skywalker family, stretching from the fall of the Republic to the final battle against the First Order. Most people break this up into 3 trilogies, each one tied to a different generation of filmmakers and fans. The original trilogy, or the OT, came first with A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and The Return of the Jedi. These shaped an entire era of filmmaking. When A New Hope came out in 1977, nobody expected it to work. George Lucas had to fight to get it made, and even some of the cast doubted it would connect. But once it did, it became something far bigger than a movie. These films built a mythos, created a template for blockbusters, and left behind a cultural imprint that still defines how science fiction is marketed today. Among fans, these are still held up as the gold standard. Then came the prequels. Lucas returned to tell the backstory in the late 90s and early 2000s with The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and Revenge of the Sith. These movies were extremely divisive from the start. Some people were drawn to the deeper world building and political intrigue, while others were put off by the heavy use of CGI, awkward pacing, and stilted dialogue. The backlash was intense, especially online, where entire forums and early YouTube channels began dissecting everything from the visual effects to the performances. The actors bore the brunt of it. Ahmed Best, who played Jar Jar Binks, and Jake Lloyd, who played young Anakin, were both harassed to the point that it affected their careers and personal lives. Still, the prequels found their defenders. Over time, the generation that grew up with them started pushing back against the criticisms, reframing these films as being misunderstood rather than misguided. That reappraisal has only grown in recent years. After Disney acquired Lucasfilm in 2012, the sequels were supposed to usher in a new era. The Force Awakens was met with curiosity and cautious optimism. It echoed the beats of the original trilogy closely, which made it feel safe to some and derivative to others. Then, The Last Jedi came out, and it split the audience in half. Literally. Some praised its willingness to subvert expectations. Others felt it abandoned the spirit of the franchise. By the time The Rise of Skywalker hit theaters, it felt like the studio was trying to patch over 2 conflicting visions, rushing to tie up loose ends and walk back previous choices. There was no clear plan anymore, and everyone could feel it. Across all 3 films, the audience response fluctuated wildly, but what remained consistent was the tension. Fans weren't just debating story decisions, they were turning on each other, on the actors, and on the filmmakers. Outside of the main saga, there were attempts to explore different corners of the galaxy. Spin-offs like Rogue One and Solo tried to fill in narrative gaps and offer standalone stories. Rogue One landed well for a lot of people. It told a smaller, more grounded story about sacrifice, and it connected directly to the events of A New Hope. Personally, I think it's the best Disney Star Wars movie that's ever been made. Solo, on the other hand, struggled to justify its existence. The backstory it provided didn't deepen Han Solo's character in any meaningful way, and the tone felt off. These projects were clearly experiments, but the reception made Disney cautious. Plans for future standalone films were shelved, and the focus shifted to streaming. All of this unfolded under what's now widely referred to as the Disney era. When Disney took over, they made sweeping changes. One of the most immediate was rebranding the expanded universe, which was decades worth of books, comics, and games, as now being non-canon. This move angered a lot of longtime fans, especially those who had spent years immersed in stories that suddenly didn't matter anymore. They viewed the new Disney films and series as straight-up replacements, and that created a sense of loss that I think never really healed. Creative decisions also came under fire. Disney was accused of pushing out content too quickly, chasing box office trends, and relying way too heavily on nostalgia to keep people invested. At the same time, the company faced backlash for trying to diversify the cast. Some fans saw this as progress, others labeled it as flat-out pandering. The actors were unfortunately caught in the middle. They were harassed online, awfully in deeply personal and ugly ways. And while George Lucas didn't direct any of these films, his shadow loomed large. He made public statements expressing disappointment with the direction things were going, and many fans used his words to fuel their own criticisms. So, when people talk about the Star Wars fandom today, they're not reacting to one film or one trilogy, but the slow erosion of trust between fans and studios, between creators and critics, between generations who see different things when they hear the word Star Wars. Or two words. The phrase Star Wars. Fuck it, you get it. But the thing is, that divide didn't start with Disney. It widened under them, and it's still growing. I think it's only fair that we hear the opinions of the man who wrote it, George Lucas. There are a lot of issues with the fans that he's addressed proactively when asked about them in interviews over the years, and I think that his perspectives can give us a glimpse into what the heart of the actual films are. Fan interpretations are one thing. The concept of the death of the author exists for a reason, but it's worth looking into what was intended if we're going to get to the heart of these issues. George Lucas broke the industry with Star Wars. It was revolutionary at the time. People had never seen anything like it, and Lucas does not shy away from acknowledging that. However, he's also quick to point out that many overlook the original themes of Star Wars, which is the allegory of war in the films. According to Lucas, when he was making the films, he wanted to make a type of mythology, so he took a look at the mythology humans had collected and created over time. The patron creates the propaganda, and what I wanted to do is go back to some of the older propaganda, which was consistent through all the societies, which is mythology. End quote. With these stories, even across different continents and cultures, there are key themes that we try to instill in our kids to this day. He tried to write Star Wars from the inside out, rather than working from the outside in, which some argue is why his films were so successful originally. They took a look at the key aspects of humanity and then built the story around that. In Star Wars, we see themes of love, betrayal, war, family, and loss, and above all, hope. All of these things make up the basis of what humanity is in the end. It's a relatable story because it's engineered from the get-go to be one. Lucas has also talked about his choice of Luke Skywalker to fulfill the role of the Chosen One. He's a kid. We start with him being a kid, dealing with his uncle giving him chores. It's relatable, and it also fits into the narrative that Lucas wanted to make a kid's film. It just happened to connect with a lot of people at the time. He recently spoke about this during the Festival de Cannes in France in May of this year, saying, quote, "Star Wars is for kids who are 12 years old. It's always been designed that way. And it's for kids during the Vietnam War where all of us were about to be drafted and people were coming back in coffins. Friends and things, and we were marching against. The civil rights movement was going on. There were a lot of things that were very dark, and I said, I want to make something. American Graffiti was so powerful for kids. I want to make another kids movie for 12-year-olds that are going through puberty, that don't know what they're doing, why they're here, asking all the questions about what should I be worried about, what should I think about, what's important. And Star Wars has all those things in there. They're buried in there, but you definitely get it." End quote. I think it's important to note the reference back to the Vietnam War that was raging at the time of Star Wars creation. It was a very real thing that the kids had to worry about at the time, especially coming off the end of World War II and during the heights of the Cold War. War was on the minds of everyone around the globe. Employing a fictional narrative that both addresses these themes and inspires hope is exactly what the people needed at the time. During the same festival, Lucas also found himself talking about diversity in Star Wars, a heated topic in the fandom at the moment. As was stated previously, this movie also came out at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. This was a time when culture was radically changing, and it seems that seeing these topics reignited has sparked a flame in Lucas, as he went on a bit of a rant when asked about this topic, saying, quote, "Well, they would say, it's all white men. I said, it's not. Most of the people are aliens, and the idea is that you're supposed to accept people for what they are, even if they're big and furry or whatever, they're green and whatever. The idea is all the people are equal." End quote. He goes on to elaborate that the only people discriminated against in Star Wars are the robots, because discrimination is also a natural part of human life, unfortunately. The us versus them mentality is very real and was an evolutionary tool for humanity for many years. To be without it completely would be unrealistic. It's clearly a topic that is very frustrating for him as he continues to go into details, talking about representation, though scarce it may be throughout his films, championing Billy Williams and Samuel L. Jackson in his speech. Lucas also doesn't shy away from calling the industry what it is. In an interview with Charlie Rose in 2015, he notes that when he sold Star Wars, it was less about selling the company for profit and more about protecting the employees working under it while also being able to pursue his personal artistic visions. He talks about longing to make movies that he wants to see, and it's well earned considering his success with the general population on more than one occasion. There's this pull in every artist to do well, but there's also the drive to make something that you're proud of. And for Lucas, Star Wars was an amazing project that he made, but he wasn't making films that were necessarily part of his tastes. He expressed interest in doing experimental films and finding comfort in his roots with films like THX 1138. He laments that studios are unwilling to take risks in the industry nowadays, stating they'd rather lose out creatively than risk losing money, which is the exact industry standard he broke through during his earlier career, making it an issue that's close to home. He doesn't shy away from noting the typical American capitalist mindset when it comes to discussing the sale of Star Wars. He elaborates that he feels as if the Star Wars films are his kids in a way. Quote, "I love them. I created them. I'm very intimately involved in them. And I sold them to the white slavers that take these things and..." End quote. He kind of chuckles after that, and maybe finding the irony in the situation considering the intended message of the story. Now, the Star Wars fandom has always had its points of tension. With such an enormous volume of media, from mainline films to obscure spin-offs, books, games, and fan edits, there's no way everyone's going to agree on what Star Wars is supposed to be. And maybe that's part of the problem. Everyone has their version of what it means, and the more the franchise tries to evolve, the more these versions collide. There's no shortage of reasonable criticism. Plenty of fans, especially those online, have spent years asking when the fandom started getting so hostile. Some point to a long history of gatekeeping that goes all the way back to the special editions of the original trilogy. Others argue that things escalated during the era of the prequels, when opinions split sharply and the internet gave people a place to vent at scale. A lot of people look at the Disney acquisition as the moment when things really fell apart, but the truth is the cracks were already there. Long before corporate mandates or streaming spin-offs, Star Wars fans were arguing about the direction of the franchise and what it was supposed to represent. The first real big shift started in 1997 when George Lucas released the special editions of the OT. These versions introduced newly rendered effects and altered scenes that didn't sit well with many longtime fans. The most infamous of these was the change to the cantina scene where Han Solo's quick draw moment is edited so that Greedo shoots first. The scene lost some of its edge, and so did Han. That one edit sparked years of frustration and became shorthand for the way Lucas was reshaping something people had already accepted and internalized. Fans didn't care about getting an updated version of the movie. They wanted the original experience that they remembered, and they felt like it was being overwritten. Because it was. You see, Lucas made it so that you couldn't really get your hands on the original theatrical cut. So, these new versions were the only versions you could get, beyond Laserdisc and an obscure DVD copy and what have you. Of course, nowadays there's the fan edits with Harmy's Despecialized and all the other ones. I'm not going to get into it now, but you get the point. By the time the prequels were released, a lot of that goodwill had worn thin. The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and Revenge of the Sith were some of the most anticipated films in human history, but the response was polarizing to say the least. Fans and critics pointed to awkward dialogue, underdeveloped characters, and an over-reliance on CG backgrounds. For many, the tone felt colder, more mechanical. The sense of adventure that defined the original trilogy seemed to be very distant and gone. Jar Jar Binks became a focal point for the backlash, but he wasn't the only reason people were frustrated. The storytelling felt off, and it didn't match what audiences thought they were coming back for. What came next helped shape how internet criticism would evolve forever. The Mr. Planket Reviews from Red Letter Media broke down the prequel trilogy with a level of detail that hadn't really been seen before in video form. They were long, heavily edited, and structured around pulling apart each film's choices with a mix of humor and genuine analysis. The tone was sharp, but it struck a chord. For the most part, they hold up exceptionally well as great pieces of film criticism on a platform notorious for hyperbolic clickbait and ragebait. And those Planket Reviews did more than criticize. They taught people how to watch movies through a different lens. In the years that followed, that format became the template for modern YouTube criticism. The structure, the pacing, the voice, all of it influenced the way media is picked apart online. That same sentiment ran through The People vs. George Lucas, a documentary that came out in 2010. It wasn't a takedown so much as a collective reckoning. Fans spoke about their deep connection to the OT and the growing sense that Lucas had drifted away from the things that they cared about the most. The film didn't deny his impact, but instead it acknowledged it fully. It also captured how far the relationship between the creator and the fan had shifted. The disappointment was real, and it had weight. I remember from this time how George Lucas was perceived as being the boogeyman that had killed Star Wars. Even though he was the creator, he had also ruined it at the same time. You could find so many rant videos against him, especially around 2011 when that new special edition had come out and he made even more changes. It's ironic now because so many fans like to say that, oh, George Lucas is the GOAT and I wish he'd come back. And it's like, that was not the sentiment back in the day. Trust me, I lived through it, man. I saw it. I really did. So when Disney stepped in to purchase Star Wars, the fandom was not united. It was already very fractured. There were years of revisionism, prequel backlash, and creator-audience tension that had created this climate where people were watching closely, ready to scrutinize whatever came next. Disney didn't start the fire, but they walked right into it and then poured gasoline all over it. Still, beyond the wave of skepticism of Disney's acquisition, there was a lot of unified hype for The Force Awakens. I remember channels like Jeremy Johns and Hello Greedo using hashtags like #InJJWeTrust.
Star Wars is in good hands, great hands, the best hands in my humble opinion that the franchise could be in. J.J. Abrams is the man for the job. The only reason anyone would ever doubt that is because they don't know a thing about him.
Which is kind of ironic looking back now after Rise of Skywalker. The Disney Star Wars era didn't just immediately start out toxic. So what happened here? One Reddit commenter made the case that a real and tangible shift in the fandom came during the release of The Last Jedi, when broader culture wars began to bleed into film discourse. According to them, content creators started monetizing outrage, realizing that attacking the movie would draw clicks. They pointed to examples like Geeks and Gamers, who allegedly praised the film at first and then reversed their opinion to chase the growing backlash.
As I'm sitting here right now, I like The Last Jedi.
It's not a conspiracy theory to suggest that outrage content spreads faster. Social media algorithms are built to prioritize strong emotional reactions. Anger keeps people engaged, and platforms know that very well. The replies to that comment, however, show how quickly even a level-headed take can get drowned out. One user responded by accusing the original poster of liberal brainwashing and fan-shaming, turning a discussion about fandom behavior into another culture war argument. And this is where most discussions about Star Wars seem to end up. Two people yelling past each other, convinced the other side is ruining something that once meant something to the other. Even among the less aggressive fans, there's a lingering frustration about the choices made over the years. When Disney bought LucasFilm, one of the first things they did was discard the entire EU, rebranding decades of stories as Star Wars Legends, or non-canon. For fans like myself who had grown up reading those books or playing those games, it felt like a massive erasure. That intent was understandable though. Nobody could realistically manage that much continuity, but the execution lacked care. The Legends rebrand was rolled out quickly, and there wasn't much effort made to reincorporate what actually worked. Some fans never got over that. They still argue to this day, almost like 15 years later, that the new content lacks the same depth or inventiveness, and whether or not you agree or disagree, it's like, let it go, guys. Others point to specific characters or stories from the EU that felt more compelling than what Disney has to offer. Which, again, I do think there's a lot of merit to that, but it's also like, it's over. Like, they're not going to go back on that. Like, it is what it is. You got to just let it go. Appreciate what you like and move on. The prequels, which once felt like the most controversial era of the franchise, had been reevaluated in recent years, but they weren't warmly received when they came out. Many critics focused on the wooden dialogue and the over-reliance on digital effects, and fans were very frustrated by the absence of a strong central protagonist and the heavy use of political exposition. And of course, there was Jar Jar. Characters like Jar Jar became lightning rods for criticism to the point that fans created their own edits of the films, removing what they saw as being tonal misfires. One of the most well-known was the Phantom Edit, which gained traction for its attempt to restructure the Phantom Menace into something closer to the tone of the original trilogy. Even that edit drew mixed responses. Some thought it went too far, stripping away the humor entirely. Others saw it as the kind of intervention that showed how invested the fanbase had become, not just in watching the films, but in reshaping them themselves. Years later, there was the sequel trilogy, which, let's really get into it now. This is where the fandom truly began to fracture in ways that haven't fully healed. The prequels at least had a defined endpoint. They were leading into a story that everyone already knew. Everyone kind of had an idea of where the dots were going to connect. But the sequels had no dots and they had no lines. There wasn't a map even. They were supposed to carry the franchise into a new era, but instead, they just exposed the cracks in Disney's strategy. The Force Awakens was familiar. Maybe too much so. It was just A New Hope again. The Last Jedi tried to break the formula and got slammed for it. The Rise of Skywalker tried to win everyone back and pleased almost no one. People were ready for new stories, but what they got felt like a game of tug-of-war between filmmakers, studio mandates, and competing fan demands. Characters were introduced without clear arcs. Motivations shifted from film to film. Some fans were disappointed with how quickly the films abandoned nuance in favor of spectacle. Others latched onto the darker aesthetic, seeing it as an upgrade. No one agreed, and everyone had a platform. Of course, this isn't just about film criticism anymore. In recent years, parts of the fandom have moved from being vocal to being outright hostile, and the people on the receiving end of that hostility have unfortunately been the actors, especially those who represent some form of diversity in the casting. Ahmed Best, who played Jar Jar Binks, was publicly bullied after The Phantom Menace, blamed for the movie's failings. The backlash nearly destroyed his career. In later interviews, he spoke openly about struggling with suicidal thoughts as a result. Jake Lloyd, who played Anakin as a child, also suffered from intense harassment, both online and in his personal life. His family has since clarified that his struggles were largely the result of mental health issues, but the fan reaction did not help. The cycle continued into modern day. Kelly Marie Tran, cast as Rose Tico from The Last Jedi, was targeted with racist and sexist attacks. She eventually deleted her social media and later wrote a New York Times essay about the pressure she felt to diminish her identity in order to fit in. Daisy Ridley, John Boyega, and others faced similar treatment, and the hate didn't just stop with the actors. Rian Johnson received death threats after The Last Jedi. Kathleen Kennedy, who has produced multiple Star Wars projects under Disney, became a lightning rod for misogynistic outrage. Even Mark Hamill joked that he felt pressured to return for the sequels out of fear that fans would turn on him if he didn't. This kind of behavior has come to define a portion of the franchise, often referred to online as the Fandom Menace. The name is used to describe a loose network of reactionary content creators and trolls who spend their time attacking media they believe is too progressive. They show up in the comments, they flood review sites, they organize around outrage, and manufacture controversy to drive attention. Their tactics echo past online campaigns like Gamergate and Comicsgate, and they've been effective, not because they represent the majority of fans, but because they know how to sustain anger and turn it into visibility. Going even more recently, the release of The Acolyte added another layer to an already tense conversation. From the start, it was framed as a bold new direction, set during the High Republic era, a century before the Phantom Menace. With a cast led by actors of color and a focus on themes like identity, power, and Force philosophy. But even with those ambitions, the show struggled to find its footing. Critics were very split. Some appreciated what it tried to do, but many pointed to the weak character work, the sluggish pacing, and a story that never really came together in the end. Viewership plummeted quickly and the early momentum faded. But the controversy wasn't limited to the show's quality itself. Showrunner Leslie Headland made several comments during the press tour that drew backlash. In one interview, she claimed she didn't consider the show to be queer with a capital Q, despite promotional material leaning heavily into themes of gender and sexuality. In another, she dismissed concerns over canon consistency as being irrelevant to what she called a vibe-based approach to storytelling. These remarks did not sit well with longtime fans, especially those who were already wary of the franchise's recent inconsistencies. The backlash, already building from the show's underwhelming execution, was further amplified by the perception that the creators were provoking their own audience. Then came what I consider to be the dumbest thing in the world, the Ki-Adi-Mundi moment. The character, who was known from the prequels, appeared in an episode despite the show being set 100 years earlier. Not really a big deal, because Wikipedia editors updated his profile to reflect the timeline change. And those editors were met with harassment and death threats. Literally anger over Glup Shadow showing up in a show that he maybe shouldn't be in. Like, these are unpaid volunteers maintaining a fan resource, and they were targeted over one entry. The Wikipedia team issued a public statement condemning the behavior, but the damage had already been done. The Acolyte was supposed to mark a shift in what Star Wars on television could look like. It had a massive budget, a fresh setting, and the chance to build something new, but none of that was enough. Many of the criticisms came from longtime fans who weren't acting in bad faith. I want to mention that. Like, they just didn't like the show, and that's valid. I think it sucks. Like, that's it. It is what it is. And when the creators respond to that kind of feedback with vague messaging or defensiveness, that divide is only going to get worse. What started as an opportunity to open new doors ended up deepening old fractures. George Lucas once said he sold Star Wars because he didn't want to deal with the hate anymore. Watching how this show was received, it's easy to understand why. Meanwhile, Andor Season 2 has been widely praised as one of the strongest Star Wars stories in recent memory. Its writing is sharp, its characters are grounded, and its focus is more intimate. The show avoids spectacle and nostalgia bait, instead building tension through politics, quiet acts of rebellion, and personal loss. It asks more of its audience, but for many, that's what makes it stand out. Still, it hasn't been without controversy, because of course not, it's Star Wars. A scene involving an attempted sexual assault sparked backlash from fans who felt that it crossed the line for a franchise long seen as being family-friendly. The creative team defended the moment as being honest to the world that they were building, a world shaped by oppression and cruelty. Others argued that the scene was handled carefully and that omitting difficult truths doesn't make the story stronger. Some critics, though, went further. Much further. The YouTuber known as Star Wars Theory dismissed Andor as being too intellectual, suggesting that fans who enjoy it more than traditional entries don't really understand what Star Wars is. In his view, being a real fan means consuming the full ecosystem of books, tie-ins, comics, the whole 9 yards, but sticking to the stories that reflect the franchise's older rhythm. He praised shows like Ahsoka for their loyalty to legacy characters and familiar beats, drawing a hard distinction between what counts as a true Star Wars story and what doesn't. Ignoring the fact that he liked Ahsoka because there were lightsabers in it and he owns a lightsaber company, we're not going to talk about that, but I'm sure he doesn't have any incentive to like a show like Ahsoka as opposed to Andor, a show with no lightsabers. That kind of thinking reinforces the problem, though. Andor was never designed to replace anything. It carved out space for a different kind of story, one that didn't rely on old icons or recognizable imagery to matter, that it still had to justify itself while nostalgia-heavy entries were embraced without question, speaks to how split this fandom has become. Some want depth, others want comfort, while other parts of the fandom are just more interested in defining who belongs and who doesn't. That tension of gatekeeping is not new by any means, but the volume has grown, and the pattern keeps repeating. A show pushes the boundaries, people push back harder, and the conversation loops all over again. So, what's the point of this whole long, drawn-out video? Basically, the Star Wars fandom has multiple pieces working against them right now, and that's why their fandom is constantly in chaos for the time being. It's a poorly managed transition of ownership combined with an increasing culture of outrage on both sides, and it's fueling this little toxic sphere that's surrounding Star Wars at the minute. There are plenty of reasonable fans of the franchise. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the majority are very reasonable people. I've never seen an argument about Star Wars get remotely as heated in person as they do in online spaces. So what does that tell you? Is it entirely the fans' fault that the fandom is in crisis? No, of course not. Plenty of fans have shown that they're more than capable of respecting the workers involved in major decisions, even when they differ in creative opinions. Disney seems to be wandering around the Star Wars universe trying to see what makes the most money above all else, while also writing themselves into the same predictable narratives and visual stunts across multiple movies and shows. Is it entirely the corporation's fault? No. Plenty of their fans have clearly shown that they do not know how to handle differing opinions when it comes to the direction of Star Wars, be it that the franchise is too personal of an issue for them, or they just find the need to be angry at someone all the time constantly. Regardless, it's up to you how you behave in the end. So make sure you ask yourself, is this the person I want to be, before you comment in shared online spaces. And with all that out of the way, I'm Cole McCormick, you're watching Firewood Media. Huge thank you to our channel members for making videos like these possible. I want to shout out Josh for helping me write this video. He helped me out with the Evangelion video and the Zack Snyder video, the very first one that I ever made. So huge help with these bigger projects. Our next one is actually a Twin Peaks video. I'm so excited, but it won't be out for a very long time. So I guess, sorry, but it is what it is. Also, big thank you to Alex for editing this video. I really appreciate all that you do as well, because without him, I would not be able to put out as much content as I do. So yeah, his first video was my Jurassic Park video essay, and I love how that one turned out. So I'm sure this is going to be fantastic. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.